In this video, we're going to talk about Chapter 3, which is Arguments by Analogy. This video is also going to cover Rule 12, which is Analogies require relevantly similar examples, as well as Exercise Set 3.1 and 3.2. All of this comes from a Workbook for Arguments by Morrow and Weston. Okay, as I said, in this video, we're going to cover the introduction to Chapter 3, Rule 12, Analogies require relevantly similar examples, Exercise Set 3.1, identifying important similarities, and Exercise Set 3.2, identifying important differences. There is an exception to Rule number 7, which is to use more than one example. Arguments by analogy, rather than multiplying examples to support a generalization, argue from one specific example to another. This type of argument reasons that because the two examples are alike in many ways, they're also alike in one further specific way. Valentina Tereshkova, Russian astronaut and first woman in space, famously quipped that if women can be railroad workers in Russia, why can't they fly in space? Russian women are as capable of demanding physical and technical work as men, Tereshkova is arguing, and as devoted to their work and their country, as proved by the example of female railroad workers. Therefore, women should also make fine astronauts. Spelled out, the argument looks like this. Women have proved themselves to be capable railroad workers in Russia. Being a railroad worker is like being an astronaut because they both make extreme physical and technical demands. Therefore, women can be capable as astronauts as well. Notice the italicized word like in the second premise. When an argument stresses the likeness between two cases, it's very probably an argument from analogy. How do we evaluate this kind of argument? The first premise of an argument by analogy makes a claim about the example used as an analogy. Remember Rule 3, make sure this premise is true. Tereshkova's argument could not even get off the ground if women had not proved themselves to be capable railroad workers in Russia. The second premise in arguments by analogy claims that the example in the first premise is like the example about which the argument draws a conclusion. Evaluating this premise requires us to ask how relevantly similar the two cases are. In an analogy, the two examples did not have to be similar in every way. After all, being an astronaut is very different than working on the railroad. Trains don't normally fly, and astronauts don't wield sledgehammers. But arguments by analogy only require relevant similarities. Technical skill and physical strength and stamina seem to be Tereshkova's real themes, and both astronauts and railroad workers require a lot of both. So how relevantly similar in the end is Tereshkova's analogy? For modern astronauts, you might think that sheer physical stamina is less relevant than skill at running experiments and making scientific observations. Skill's not necessarily related to being a good railroad worker. In Tereshkova's time, however, physical strength and stamina were much more important, as was body size. The early capsules were quite small, and this actually suited women's physiques better. The other key factor was that early Russian astronauts had to eject from their capsules and parachute to the ground at the end of their mission, and Tereshkova was a champion parachutist. This was probably the key factor and is related to strength and stamina, though not to railroad work. Tereshkova's analogy partially succeeds then, especially for her time, though it's a little less persuasive now. But of course, since there have been many successful female astronauts, it's also less necessary now. Here is a more challenging argument from analogy. An interesting switch was pulled in Rome yesterday by Adam Nordwell, an American Chippewa chief, as he descended his plane from California dressed in full tribal regalia. Norwell announced in the name of the American Indian people that he was taking possession of Italy by right of discovery, in the same way that Christopher Columbus did in America. I proclaim this day the day of the discovery of Italy, said Nordwell. What right did Columbus have to discover America when it had already been inhabited for thousands of years. The same right I now have to come to Italy and proclaim the discovery of your country. Nordwell is suggesting that his discovery of Italy is like Columbus's discovery of America in at least one important way. Both Nordwell and Columbus claimed a country that already had been inhabited by its own people for centuries. Thus, Nordwell insists that he has as much right to claim Italy as Columbus had to claim America. But of course, Nordwell has no right at all to claim Italy. So it follows that Columbus had no right at all to claim America. Here's what this argument would look like. Premise 1. Nordwell has no right to claim Italy for another people, let alone by right of discovery, because Italy has been inhabited by its own people for centuries. Columbus's claim to America by right of discovery is like Nordwell's claim to Italy, right? America, too, had been inhabited by its own people for centuries. And so, therefore, Columbus has no right to claim America for another people, let alone by right of discovery. So how good is Nordwell's analogy? Obviously, 20th century Italy is not just like 15th century America. Italy's known to every 20th century schoolchild, whereas America's unknown to much of the world in the 15th century. Nordwell's not an explorer, and a commercial jet isn't the same as a Santa Maria. But are these differences relevant to Nordwell's analogy? Nordwell simply means to remind us that it's senseless to claim a country already inhabited by its own people. Whether that land is known to the world's school children or how the discoverer arrived there isn't really that important. The more appropriate reaction might have been to try to establish diplomatic relations, as we would try to do today if somehow the land or the people of Italy had just been discovered. That's Nordwell's point, and taken in that way, his analogy makes a good and unsettling argument. All right, on to exercise set 3-1, identifying important similarities. The objective of this exercise is to give you practice identifying the kind of similarities needed to support an argument by analogy. There are a lot of different answers you can give to all of the questions that we're going to look at. What matters is that you come up with important similarities between two things that might initially seem very different. Roughly, a similarity is important if noticing that the two things are similar in that way gives you a reason to think that the things might be similar in some other way. For instance, noticing that Belize and New Zealand both have English as an official language is a reason to think that they were both British colonies. Noticing that they both have the letter E in their name doesn't allow you to draw many inferences about one country based on what you know about the other. So here's the instructions for this exercise set. For each of the following pairs of things, come up with 1 to 3 important ways in which the things are similar. All right, the sample. Adopting a dog and having a child. So in what ways are these things relevantly similar? Well, adopting a dog is like having a child in that both require taking responsibility for another living being. Also, they can both turn your home into a big mess. All right, there's a couple of relevant examples. Okay, question number 1. Being a student and having a job. What are the relevant similarities between those? Being a student and having a job both involve specific tasks that you're expected to do at specific times. Both give you the chance to develop new skills. And you can get kicked out of school or lose your job if you don't perform well. So as we see, there's actually quite a few similarities between being a student and having a job. All right, question 3. First-degree murder and euthanasia. This is euthanasia is physician-assisted suicide. All right, what are the similarities? Well, first-degree murder and euthanasia both involve intentionally causing someone's death, and both are illegal in most places, although, interestingly, Oregon is an exception to this. Doctor-assisted suicide is legal in Oregon. Question 9. A mouse and an adult human. what are the relevant similarities between these two? Well, mice and humans are both mammals. Both can get cancer. And many things that are toxic to mice are also toxic to humans. That's a pretty good overview of things that mice and humans have in common. All right, so now we're going to move on to exercise set 3.2, identifying important differences. The objective of this exercise is to give you practice identifying the kinds of differences that you'll need to consider in evaluating an argument by analogy. A few tips for success. As in exercise 3.1, there are a lot of different answers you're going to be able to give for each pair. Your criterion for important differences should be similar to the criterion used for important similarities in the previous exercise. A difference is important for our purposes if noticing the difference makes it harder to draw conclusions about one thing from characteristics of the first. For instance, New Zealand and Belize are both former British colonies. So, you might expect them to be culturally similar. An important difference, however, is that Belize is in Latin America, whereas New Zealand isn't. This makes it less likely that they're culturally similar. An unimportant difference, for just about all purposes, is that New Zealand's capital's by the water, whereas Belize's isn't. Okay, so this is the difference between important differences and unimportant differences. All right, the instructions. We're going to go back to the pairs of things that were listed in exercise 3.1, and for each pair we're going to identify 1 to 3 important ways in which the things are different. My sample slide got mixed up here, but adopting a dog and having a child. So the important differences, adopting a dog differs from having a child, and that having a child involves taking on a lot more responsibility, creates a much longer commitment, and eventually leads to there being another adult human being in the world. Yes, I'm sure something many of us were thinking about when we are coming up with the relevant similarities for this example. Okay, let's move on to 1. Being a student and having a job. All right, the relevant differences here, one usually pays to be a student, but one gets paid to do a job. Now, notice that there aren't a ton of relevant differences. Maybe we could use this in an argument against why people think that there's a huge difference between being in school and working. I don't know. I'll leave it up to you. Question 3. First-degree murder and euthanasia, or physician-assisted suicides. So what are the relevant differences here? Well, first-degree murder involves killing someone against their will, whereas euthanasia involves helping someone die with their consent or upon their request. Euthanasia is, according to this definition that we're using here, necessarily performed by a doctor, whereas murder can be committed by anyone. Those are some relevant differences between murder and euthanasia. All right, relevant differences between a mouse and an adult human. Mice are far less intelligent than humans. Compared to human embryos, mouse embryos have a higher level of antioxidant called glycathone. Okay, there's some important differences between a mouse and an adult human.